A woman told the truth at the United Nations and lost her job overnight. That was not a rumor, not an exaggeration. It was history repeating itself in the 21st century. Dr. Arikana, the African Union's ambassador to Washington, was not overthrown by a coup or targeted by an assassin's bullet. Her weapon was a microphone, her crime was honesty, and her punishment was silence. She dared to declare what polite diplomacy never utters, that colonialism did not end, it only changed its costume. 14 African nations still chained to the CFA franc. Uranium dug from Niger to power Paris, while Nigerians sit in darkness. Oil pumped from Nigeria to fill European tanks, while Nigerians queue for petrol. Contracts written decades ago still bleeding the continent dry. And for saying this in the capital of the United States, she was fired. Not because she was weak, but because she was dangerous. Not to Africa, but to those who profit from Africa. Stay with us. This is not just a headline, it is a turning point in history. Subscribe now and walk with us through the story. The story of Dr. Arikana does not begin with her dismissal. It begins with a stage, a microphone, and a truth that had been buried under decades of polite speeches and diplomatic smiles. In Washington, where she was meant to perform the role of ribbon cutter, handshaker, and goodwill messenger, she chose instead to be a mirror, showing Africa and the West the face they did not want to see. Her message was devastating in its simplicity. Colonialism never died. It simply rebranded itself. Instead of flags and bayonets, it now wore the suit of economics, the language of aid, and the contracts of trade. Instead of occupying armies, it left behind military bases and training programs. Instead of direct rule, it secured financial chains that no parliament in Africa had the power to break. She spoke of the CFA franc, a currency that sounds harmless but is in fact a shackle. 14 nations still tied to a monetary system printed in Paris, guaranteed by the French Treasury, with 50% of their foreign reserves deposited in France. Imagine working all month only for half of your wages to be wired to another man's account, and then being forced to ask permission to use what belongs to you. That is not independence. That is financial slavery dressed as partnership. She lifted the veil on resources that have fueled Western prosperity for generations. Uranium mined in Niger keeps the lights on in French cities, yet villages in Niger remain in darkness. Oil flowing out of Nigeria powers engines in Europe, yet Nigerian citizens queue at empty petrol stations. Cobalt extracted from the Democratic Republic of Congo forms the backbone of modern technology, from smartphones to electric cars. Yet Congolese miners live in poverty. The irony is not hidden. It is the very design of the system. For decades, these arrangements were justified as development aid, as partnership agreements, as the price of progress. But Dr. Arikana stripped away the euphemisms. She called it what it was, theft with a smile. Africa is not poor, she declared. It is being robbed, a sentence that cut deeper than any report because it carried both fact and fury. Her speeches challenged not only the economic status quo, but also the silence of African elites. She pointed out how contracts signed in the 1950s still bind entire nations, forbidding them from seeking alliances outside French approval, mandating French as the language of education, and limiting their military training to France. In essence, entire generations born after independence remained trapped in the very structures their parents had celebrated escaping. In public halls, her words echoed like a drumbeat, but in private offices, they rang like alarm bells. Western governments could ignore protests on African streets, but they could not ignore an ambassador speaking such truths on American soil. Here was not an activist in exile, not a radical outsider, but the official representative of the African Union. That difference turned her into a threat, and so the punishment came swiftly. She was fired, not debated, not defended, silenced. The message was clear. In a world where wealth still flows from African soil to Western capitals, those who expose the pipelines must be cut off. Yet her dismissal did not erase her words. Instead, it amplified them. Across the continent, across the diaspora, people began to ask the question that burns through the heart of her story. If she was wrong, why fire her? That question was the crack in the mask, and it led directly to the storm that followed. When Dr. Arikana raised her voice, she was not addressing a conference hall in Accra or Lagos. She was standing in Washington, the capital of the United States, where the guardians of the global order sit. And that detail made all the difference. Her message was no longer Africa whispering to itself. It was Africa speaking to the West on its own soil. Her words detonated the script. She was not supposed to remind audiences that France still prints money for sovereign nations. She was not supposed to say that Western aid is not a gift, but a leash. She was not supposed to point at embassies in African capitals and call them power centers pulling strings behind the scenes. Yet she did, clearly, directly, and without apology. The reaction was immediate. She was branded radical. Newspapers and diplomats dismissed her as too emotional, too confrontational. But here is the paradox. If she had truly been irrelevant, they would have laughed and ignored her. Instead, they panicked. Because when uncomfortable truths echo inside American lecture halls, the danger is not that Africans will hear them. The danger is that Western citizens will. History gives us a grim roll call of leaders who paid the price for challenging this order. Patrice Lumumba in Congo, assassinated when he sought true independence. Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, killed after declaring that dignity matters more than aid. Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, overthrown when he tried to chart a Pan-African course. Each of them understood that independence is not symbolic anthems or flags. It is control over currency, resources, and policy. Each of them terrified colonial powers by saying the unsayable. Dr. Arikana was not overthrown, but she was pushed out quietly. Her firing was a different kind of coup, one waged not with soldiers, but with silence. Yet for many Africans, it confirmed what they had long suspected. The institutions meant to defend them were compromised. The African Union, by dismissing her, seemed less a champion of sovereignty and more an extension of the pressures applied from outside. But on the streets of Africa and in the digital town squares of social media, her voice found new resonance. In Ouagadougou, Bamako, Niamey, and beyond, people saw her words as part of a wider awakening. The timing was striking. While she was being silenced in Washington, young leaders in West Africa were rising, declaring openly that their nation's resources would no longer be drained for the profit of others. The name Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso became a rallying cry. His insistence that gold, land, and dignity belong to the people of Burkina Faso echoed the very truths Dr. Arikana had spoken in America. Western media tried to draw a line between these voices, dismissing them as unconnected bursts of rhetoric. But ordinary Africans connected the dots. The pattern was too clear. Every time the script of dependency was challenged, punishment followed. Sometimes in the form of coups engineered from outside, sometimes in assassinations, and sometimes in the form of dismissals dressed as routine bureaucratic changes. And so the question lingered in living rooms and marketplaces. Why are African voices welcomed when they praise aid, but silenced when they demand sovereignty? That question is not academic. It is political dynamite. Her firing did not end her influence, it magnified it. Diaspora communities began sharing her speeches online. Students quoted her words in classrooms. Radio stations replayed her interviews. By trying to bury her, they had planted a seed. And from that seed rose the possibility of something larger. Because if one ambassador could shake the walls of Washington with a microphone, what might millions of young Africans achieve if they refused silence altogether? The stage was set, the mask slipping. The world now had to confront a new chapter. Africa was not just a continent of victims. It was a continent of voices, and one of them had just torn through the illusion of polite diplomacy. But the storm was only beginning, and the silence of institutions like the African Union begged an even sharper question. If the guardians of Africa will not protect its truth-tellers, who will? The dismissal of Dr. Arikana Chihombrequao was not merely the silencing of one woman. It was a signal, a warning shot to anyone who dared to break the polite silence surrounding Africa's place in the global order. Yet the signal did not have the intended effect. Instead of deterring debate, it ignited it. In the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, young men and women saw her fate as proof of what they already knew. The system was never designed to protect their sovereignty. If the African Union could dismiss its own ambassador simply for exposing neo-colonial structures, then who truly held the Union's leash? Was it an organization representing Africa, or an institution bound by the pressures of Paris, Brussels, and Washington? The political ripple was immediate. In Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, leaders began to speak the same unspeakable truths she had voiced. They declared that the wealth beneath their soil, gold, uranium, oil, belonged first to their people, not to foreign corporations. This was not coincidence. It was a growing pattern, an awakening of nations long trapped in unequal contracts. For citizens, the impact was profound. Many had grown up believing that aid was a lifeline, that Western partnerships were essential, that dependency was natural. But hearing Dr. Arikana's speeches reframed everything. If aid was not a gift but a leash, then breaking that leash became not an act of recklessness, but of dignity. Suddenly, resistance was no longer treason. It was self-respect. Economically, the debate grew sharper. Citizens began to question why their currencies were printed abroad, why their reserves sat in Parisian banks, why contracts signed before they were born still dictated the price of their future. The injustice was no longer abstract. It was personal. It was a father queuing for petrol in Lagos while oil tankers sailed to Europe. It was a mother in Niamey watching her children do homework by candlelight while uranium kept French homes warm. And politically, the anger turned into a demand for change. The silence of the African Union in defending Dr. Arikana was seen as complicity. Instead of representing the people, it seemed to represent the continuity of dependency. That gap widened the trust deficit between ordinary Africans and their institutions. Citizens began asking, if our ambassadors cannot speak the truth, then who speaks for us? It is in this climate that leaders like Ibrahim Traoré rose to prominence. His words in Burkina Faso, that the nation's resources belong to the people of Burkina Faso, resonated far beyond his borders. They mirrored the very truths that had cost Dr. Arikana her position. To many, his leadership became the embodiment of what some began calling the Ibrahim Traoré coup. Not simply a military takeover, but a symbolic revolt against the silence imposed by neo-colonial powers. For Western governments, this was dangerous. For ordinary Africans, it was liberating. The fear that had kept people quiet for decades began to crumble. If an ambassador in Washington could risk everything by speaking out, then why should villagers, students, or workers remain silent at home? The social impact was just as significant. Diaspora communities felt vindicated. They had long been told that their role was to send remittances, to assimilate, to watch Africa from afar. But Dr. Arikana's words reminded them that their voices, investments, and skills were not optional extras. They were essential to the continent's rebirth. Her dismissal was not an ending, it was a challenge. By the time her speeches spread across social media, they had become rallying cries. Students chanted her words at protests. Activists quoted her in town halls. Markets buzzed with conversations about money, contracts, and dignity. For the first time in years, the language of sovereignty was not confined to dusty textbooks. It was alive in daily conversations. And so the consequences of her firing became larger than the event itself. The AU had sought to remove a thorn. Instead, it had planted seeds of defiance, seeds that were beginning to germinate in every corner of Africa. The question now was no longer whether her dismissal was justified. It was whether Africa itself would continue to accept the silence. And that question, once spoken aloud, could not be unasked. The storm surrounding Dr. Arikana's dismissal did not stay within African borders. It drew the world's attention to a deeper contradiction. Africa is one of the most resource-rich continents on Earth. Yet when global decisions are made, Africa's voice is absent. At the United Nations, the hypocrisy is written into the very structure of power. 54 African countries make up more than a quarter of the General Assembly. Yet the body that truly decides on matters of war, peace, and sanctions, the Security Council, has 5 permanent members: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. None of them African, each with a veto that can override the voices of the entire continent. In practice, this means that when Africa says no, it does not matter. If even one of those 5 says yes, Africa's voice is drowned. Dr. Arikana's outrage was not abstract. She had seen this hypocrisy from inside the system. The blue flags, the peacekeeping missions, the speeches of equality, all masks hiding the same imbalance of power that had existed since 1945, when colonial empires still ruled half the globe. Britain and France were granted permanent seats while their colonies were voiceless. Decades later, the colonies gained independence, but the seats remained frozen in time. This imbalance is not without consequence. When conflict erupts in Africa, peacekeepers arrive, often underfunded, often criticized, but the continent itself has no permanent say in the rules that govern those interventions. Africa supplies the battlefields, the soldiers, and the victims, but never the veto. It is like being dragged into a courtroom where you are always the defendant but never the judge. The African Union and ECOWAS are often portrayed as Africa's defenders, But when Dr. Arikana was removed, many saw those organizations less as guardians of sovereignty and more as conduits of external pressure. The silence from these bodies raised an uncomfortable question. Were they representing African peoples or managing African compliance with a system built elsewhere? The international press, too, played its role. Western outlets branded her message as extreme, but avoided debating her facts. Because facts are harder to dismiss. 14 nations still chained to the CFA franc. Uranium and cobalt still flowing outward while citizens live in scarcity. Those realities are political dynamite, not only in Africa but in Western democracies. If citizens in Paris, London, or Washington connected the dots, they might see their prosperity not as self-made, but as subsidized by African extraction. That is why her voice was so dangerous. And that is why the movements in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, often described as the Burkina Faso Revolution, cannot be dismissed as isolated events. They are part of a wider reckoning, a reminder that Africa is no longer whispering. It is demanding a seat at the table, or else threatening to build its own. But the world is not eager to share power. And so the question lingers. If the institutions will not change, what options remain for Africa? Every struggle in history eventually asks the same question. What comes next? For Africa, that question is no longer theoretical. It is urgent, immediate, and unavoidable. The dismissal of Dr. Arikana Chihombori proved that truth-tellers will not be sheltered by polite diplomacy. Yet her words also revealed something more powerful, that Africa's future is not condemned to dependency. The continent holds the keys to its own liberation, but only if it dares to use them. The path forward is not paved with aid contracts or donor pledges. It is paved with sovereignty. That means shifting from raw exports to value-added industries. Imagine cobalt mined in Congo not leaving as ore, but leaving as batteries produced by African factories. Imagine Ghanaian gold transformed into finished jewelry rather than bullion shipped abroad. Imagine Nigerian oil fueling local refineries, supplying African households first before feeding foreign markets. Each step would be more than economics. It would be a declaration of dignity. This transformation cannot be carried by governments alone. It requires the energy of Africa's diaspora, the very force Dr. Arikana called a secret weapon. Doctors, engineers, entrepreneurs, and coders who left the continent must be invited to return, not as saviors, but as builders. A Ghanaian surgeon trained in New York opening a hospital in Accra. A Nigerian programmer in Toronto founding a tech hub in Lagos. Each return weakens the dependency cycle. Each investment plants another seed of sovereignty. But the road is not without risks. Western powers accustomed to extraction will resist any shift that threatens their supply chains. Aid may be withdrawn, contracts may be weaponized, sanctions may be imposed. The pressure will be immense. Yet pressure is not new to Africa. For centuries, this soil has carried weight, from chains of slavery to contracts of debt, and still the continent endures. What makes this moment different is the spirit rising within it. Young leaders like Ibrahim Traoré are no longer asking politely. They are insisting. Citizens are no longer waiting for permission. They are demanding. And diaspora voices are no longer whispering. They are shouting in unison with the continent. The metaphor of the seed captures this perfectly. For too long, Africa's seeds have been exported. Cocoa, coffee, cotton, enriching others while leaving the soil bare. Now the seed of sovereignty is being planted in Africa's own ground. It may take time, it may face storms, but once it roots, it will grow into a harvest no foreign hand can claim. The path ahead is not easy, but history shows that nations do not gain dignity by waiting. They seize it, nurture it, and defend it. And Africa, once dismissed as powerless, is beginning to do exactly that. The only question left is whether the world is ready, because Africa's richest day has yet to come. The story of Dr. Arikana Chihombori is not only about one ambassador losing her job. It is about a continent that refuses to lose its voice. By exposing the pipelines of wealth extraction, from the CFA franc to uranium, oil, and cobalt, she tore away the mask of polite diplomacy. And for that, she was punished. Yet her punishment revealed something her silence never could: the depth of fear in those who still profit from Africa. Her dismissal became a catalyst. Across the continent, from Ouagadougou to Lagos, her words echo in the voices of citizens who now question why their futures are mortgaged to contracts written before their births. Across the diaspora, her message reignited a sense of duty, a reminder that Africa's rebirth is not a dream, but a responsibility. The struggle is not without cost. Leaders like Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, and Muammar Gaddafi paid the ultimate price. Today, Ibrahim Traoré stands as the heir to that legacy, embodying what many call the Ibrahim Traoré coup. Not just a political upheaval, but a refusal to let Africa remain chained. His message is simple, yet revolutionary. Resources belong to the people, not to outsiders. And in that truth lies the seed of Africa's future. But this awakening is bigger than one leader. It is part of a wider tide, a movement many describe as the Burkina Faso Revolution. A revolution not defined by tanks or battles, but by dignity, sovereignty, and a refusal to beg for aid. A revolution that insists Africa is not poor, it is rich, and its wealth must finally serve its own children. The message is clear. Africa's silence has ended. Its future will not be written in Paris, London, or Washington. It will be written in the calloused hands of its people, in the courage of its youth, in the determination of its diaspora. The question then is not whether Africa can rise. It is whether the world is ready for an Africa that no longer bends. If this story stirs something within you, do not turn away. Subscribe, share, and stand with us, because the fight for sovereignty is not over. It has only just begun.